Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be doing CosmosDB triggers again. However, we're going to be running a pre-trigger and a post-trigger in C#, Java and JavaScript. Last time, or in the last video rather, we looked at this roadblock which basically said that we could only run one trigger per operation. And at the time we thought there was only one pre-trigger or post-trigger, so we devised a way to actually run either a pre-trigger, post-trigger, or both of them in one operation. Now, however, I realized that I made a mistake. So essentially what this note meant is that we could only run one trigger type per operation, and it didn't mean that running a pre-trigger and a post-trigger would result in an error. My bad for the confusion there. However, I'm still curious about this line where you can only execute one trigger per operation. And now with this understanding, does it mean that if we have 3 pre-triggers that only the first one would run, or would it be an overall error? But stick around to a bit later in the video where we'll discover this. So today we know that we ran a pre-trigger and a post-trigger in Python, but we still need to find out how does this behave in the other programming languages. And this is what this video is then entailed to achieve until we get everybody to the same table, or bring everybody to the table, as it were. So I know this would involve a lot of planning and a lot of coding across multiple languages, so there was a bit of a game plan that we needed to put first. And we noticed that the entire application scope is essentially a code base that takes a random movie from a CSV file, creates an item with a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, and CosmosDB returns a custom response based on that code. So we need to package this entire thing, right? And then run it against each and every language and see the results, whether it's a success, whether there's some things we need to note, or whether there are other things or notes that we need to put across the different programming languages. And with all of those notes together, we would be able to find out how to run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, irrespective of which programming language your context might use. And this tactic is similar then to a gauntlet. So first up is C#. So in Visual Studio, we have the entire code base here. So for C# and the other examples, and then within C#, we have the Cosmos wrapper as well as the program. So I'm just going to overview the program. So all we're doing is that we're pulling a movie at random, and then with that movie, we are then going to run the Cosmos wrapper, which in turn will run the triggers. So as I mentioned, we'll run the validation and the count trigger, as well as the intercept and then the count trigger. So I won't go into too much details in terms of how we pull the movie or how we format that data, because this use case might be different to your use case, and you might have different other approaches to managing the data or even pulling the data. But what we want to focus on is how we actually run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger within C# and the other languages. So within this Cosmos wrapper, we have the generic values or functions to connect to CosmosDB as well as to pull the container. But once we have the container, what we're focusing on is these two functions over here. We'll zoom in. So within these two functions, what we're going to do then is that there's an option, or there's a value or method called item request options. And you'd notice within this is how we're able to then specify which triggers to run. And as you can see, the pre-trigger and the post-trigger are sent in as separate parameters. So our validate movie date is here, as well as our count movie and genre. Then what I did is that we're taking this and assigning it to a variable called triggers. And then with that variable, when we try and insert the item in the container, we pass the item and we pass the request options. But because our request options only has triggers in it, I've just called it triggers. And then once we get back the result, we return it to the caller. And then if there's an error, which we anticipate, we will then log the error accordingly. So if I go into request options, we would notice that within the request options class, right, both the pre-trigger and the post-triggers are sent as separate attributes or properties. And that's how we're able to run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger within C#. So let me jump back to our main program and then try and debug it. Okay, so once the debug started, we're just going to look through the values that it brings back as well as any errors that it brings back as well. So once we reach this line here, we should see that error within the debug. So it says here, system not implemented, that's fine. But once we get into the earlier debug that we see over here, we would notice that error that we were expecting. No timestamp found within the movie Flyer Man. So we did run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, but the pre-trigger failed, so the post-trigger didn't go through. And then if we also check within CosmosDB, this movie called Flyman is not inserted. So back in CosmosDB, I'm going to insert the movie name here. And we would see that it is not inserted. So let's try and run the intercept and then the count trigger. So to run the intercept and count trigger, I'm going to then comment out this line and then rerun the debug. Right, so once the debug ran, we can see our values in here on the top left. And then within the response, there's the resource. And within the resource, that's our actual values in terms of what is returned. But then we could also see it here once I click the next option, and you can see it's printed out to the terminal. So we have the summary of like the genre comedy and how many movies are within that genre, excluding the one that we just inserted. So it says here it's 2, so we'll make a total of 3. And then we'd have the actual value that was inserted into the CosmosDB database. I know highlighting here might be difficult to read. So what I'll do is I'll take the movie ID and check within Cosmos if it was inserted. So pasting it in here, I'll run the query. So once it's pasted in and we ran the query, you can see, okay, the movie was inserted. And then here at the bottom, you would see that a timestamp was added, as well as the date time format was changed to year, month, day. Whereas in Visual Studio, we would see that it's month, day, year, and there's no timestamp value. So this did execute a pre-trigger and a post-trigger. So the C# version worked. So just reviewing the syntax, we would see that it worked because the trigger or the parameters or the values for triggers were passed in as a item request option, which is optional. And this item request options class has multiple properties. And within those properties, we can see that post triggers and pre-triggers are sent in separately. So you can run them together, which means that it executed. We were able to see that custom response. So overall, it passed. Next, we're going to look into Java. So I have the Java application here open. And one thing I noticed with Java is that it has a lot of dependencies or multiple dependencies. So just looking at the reference library, there's a ton of multiple jar files that we needed to fetch just to get this to work, which was a nightmare to compile. And we kept running into these exceptions saying that we are missing a class. So trying to find the exact jar file to pull in was a tedious task, but eventually we pulled all the jar files together to run the application. And the Java code base is no different than the C# one, at least in structure. We're still getting a movie from the CSV, and then we are trying to then run the validation, the count trigger, as well as the other triggers, which we'll get into. So if I go into the Cosmos wrapper, we would see that we were first using the Azure Cosmos Spark version of this SDK. I tried using the initial one, but I kept running into errors and trying to figure out how to work with a mono class. And honestly, looking for more jar files slowly reduced my will to live. So I used this version and it worked fairly simply enough in terms of what I needed it to do. So we have the generic process to get the client, the database, and the container. I noted here in terms of the Cosmos builder, this might change in terms of the SDK that you're using for Java, but the initial concept is the same in terms of pulling the client and the database and the container. But what we're mainly focusing on is the triggers. So I have the validation and the count trigger. I split them separately, but you could have these as one method and just pass in the options. But for this example, we have them split so you can see the difference or how this is done. So we have this Cosmos item request options, which is similar to how C# did it. And then because this is Java, we're using getters and setters to set the properties to the various triggers that we want to run. Then once we have those set, we would then create the item with the item itself and then the options and then return the response to the caller. So I'll jump into this item request option so you can actually see the definition. So we'd have this class and we'd note here that both the pre-trigger and the post-trigger are separate. And we noted that they are private. That is why you would need getters and setters to essentially set those attributes. So let's try and debug in this one with the validation then count trigger and see the results. So once the debug is started, we see that we have this error here. And if we read into the error, we'd see, okay, that it's a bad request. And we would see as well that we get the error that we anticipated. There's no timestamp found in the movie Bedtime for Timmy. So that works. Now let's try the other one. Awesome. So it went through. Let me just take a note of the ID and check within CosmosDB if it went through as well first. So within CosmosDB, if we check for this movie, Chet Baker, we would see that it was inserted as well as the timestamp and the date values have been changed. But we would notice something if we go back into Java, which I'll show shortly. So within Java, we are about here where we want to output the response. But when we do output the response, we get this object as opposed to the actual JavaScript or content of the response. And when I looked into the actual variable, I noted that, okay, there's the response, there's the resource response, which is something we would see in the other SDKs as well. And then there's the response as the byte array. So we have two possible locations to find the actual content of that custom response. So if we dig deeper into response, resource response, the response there, and then the store response, then we'd see, okay, there's also the actual content as a byte array. But the only issue with this is that these two variables are private variables because of how the Java SDK was structured. And I'll show that shortly as well. So if we jump into So if we jump into the Cosmos wrapper and we look at the Cosmos item response, you notice that, okay, the response as byte array is not a public variable, as well as the resource response. So both of these are not publicly available outside of the class or package. So we can't actually access these variables in our broader application. So we can't actually see the custom response, even though it's there, which does make it a bit tricky. So within our notes, we saw that, okay, we can run the pre-trigger and post-trigger with the request, because the pre-trigger and post-trigger are separate variables, but they're both private. And because they're both private, we have to use getters and setters to actually set or determine or define or describe the triggers that we want to run. But the only issue with running it in Java is, though it executes both the pre-trigger and post-trigger, there's no way, at least in this jar file, to see the custom response. And based on that, it might be a yay or nay if this execution passed in your example. Different use cases might have different approaches. For your use case, you just probably need it to execute and you don't need to see the response. But for me, I noted that if I can't see the response or if I can't log back what happened in CosmosDB, it might be a bit tricky for me to pass this one. Plus, if I need to find another jar file, I would be very miserable. So I put this as a question mark, but feel free to put down in the comments whether this is a pass for you. I just can't look at another jar file. JavaScript. On a lighter note, using JavaScript was extremely intuitive, especially coming from a C# and Python background, so much so that I have changed the structure of the program slightly, whereby the container and the running of the triggers are within this insert movie file here, but the instance is still the same. We are still fetching a movie at random, and we are still initializing a container, then running the two triggers and getting the result back and pushing it into the console. So looking at the Cosmos wrapper, what we're doing is that we're doing the same boilerplate code in terms of initializing the container and the database. And once the container is returned, then we're using a separate functional module to run the triggers. So in the separate module, you can see the validation and count trigger, as well as the intercept and count trigger. So what we're doing here is just returning the response or the result of this container.create. And you can see here we're passing an item and we're passing a object that has the pre-trigger include and post-trigger include as string arrays. And once this is passed, or once this is executed, the result would then be returned back to the client. So back in our main movie file, I'm going to then try and run the validation then count trigger. So once the debug started, we can see the movie that was selected as well as the response that came back fairly quickly. So if I scroll up to the top, the movie was My America, and then if we look at this, we get the error in question. There was no timestamp found in the movie My America. So now I'm going to check in CosmosDB as per the other ones to see if it was inserted. And in running the query, we would see that no movie was inserted for this. So I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio Code and try the other triggers. So what I'll do is I'll comment out this line over here and rerun. Right, and once the debug has started, I'll just put a breakpoint here between the console.log, and we would see the data we wanted to insert with the movie ID, as well as the response. And within the response, similar to the other programming languages, there's a resource, and then within the resource, it would actually show the object that was returned. So I'm going to click to step over, And what we would see is the actual response as well, the custom response. So the movie name is here. And then we have this custom response that we would get back from the count post trigger. So in the documentary, there's 7 movies, excluding the one that we're going to insert, as well as the one that we just inserted. And we would notice here that there is a timestamp and the release date has been changed, which is different from the data that we had previously. So you can see the release date here and the release date there are 2 different formats. So I'm going to check in CosmosDB just to confirm this. And in CosmosDB, we can see the movie was inserted, as well as the changes made or the updates made to the release date, as well as the timestamp value. So JavaScript works completely. Back in the notes, just to understand the syntax, we would see that in creating an item in the container, the triggers can be passed in as part of the request options. And the create method in itself returns a promise. But within the request options, there's a ton of properties, and we see within these properties, the post trigger include and the pre-trigger include are separate properties, so they can be passed in together. And then once they're passed in together, both of their triggers can then be executed. So in terms of JavaScript or Node.js, we have ticks all across the board. So as a bonus, we did mention that what happens if you run multiple of the same trigger. Would the first one run, or would it just be a failure? So I'll jump into Visual Studio Code so we can see how that would operate. So within Visual Studio Code, I'll run the example across both the Python and the JavaScript SDKs. And then within the Python SDK, all we're going to do is that we're going to run the interception and then the validation trigger. I did it this way around just to make sure that the validation trigger didn't block or cause any errors before the interception trigger ran, because we aren't sure at this moment if it would run the first one or if it would just fail. So within the triggers page, I'm just going to go look for that method. And we would see here that the pre-trigger include has the array. And what I'm doing is that I'm passing an intercept movie and validate movie date as the array, and we're going to see the response that it brings back. So I'll jump back to the Python and I'll run a debug file. So we get back the movie that we wanted to insert. And then I'm going to try and run these 2 triggers together. And then we see here that it's actually an error. So the error that it brings back is that too many pre-triggers were specified. We only allowed to do 1. Instead, we requested 2. So that would solve the question. It would be an overall error, but then the error would be specified. Just for interest sake, I'm going to run it as well within JavaScript. So we have the same layup. Within JavaScript, what we're going to do is that we're going to pass the intercept and the validate, but we're going to switch it around. And in this case, we're going to then run this as well. So once the movie has been picked and the triggers are tried to be executed, we see the same type of error. Too many pre-triggers specified. Max allowed 1, requested 2. So overall, if we try and run multiple of the same trigger, we would see that it would return back an error. There might be some future use cases where we see, okay, how do we run multiple of the same trigger? But we'll leave that at a later stage. So in summary, what we saw is that both a pre-trigger and a post-trigger can be called in all of the various SDKs. We saw that the trigger definitions in all of them are passed as 2 separate arguments. And then we saw that within Java specifically, there isn't any custom response from the triggers. So if you had a post trigger that returned a custom body, then you wouldn't be able to see that custom body within Java unless there's a specific jar file or library that would facilitate that. And then lastly, we saw that if you run multiple of the same triggers, so if you run 2 pre-triggers or 2 post-triggers, then we would see that an error would be coming back instead of the first trigger coming through. So that would do it for this video, but there's still a few more videos on CosmosDB triggers and CosmosDB as a whole, maybe lining it up with other technologies and seeing how we can combine them together. But in terms of this video, we've proven that we can run triggers in multiple programming languages, but I think for the future videos, we might just stick to Python or JavaScript. Feel free to, if you have any questions, to leave them down below, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you in the next one.